Good evening. It's 7:30, it's Wednesday, it must be the Shakespeare Hour, live. Great to be with you again. My name is Simon Godwin, and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington, D.C. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking our show sponsor tonight, Barbara Fleischman. Barbara, you are doing so much to support arts organizations in New York, in London, and in Washington. And we're so grateful for your support tonight. Thank you. The Shakespeare Hour is part of Shakespeare Everywhere, a broader initiative that is sponsored by the visionary Beach Street Foundation. My thanks as well to them. Now, the generosity of so many of you to the Phoenix Fund here at SDC has meant that we've been able to maintain 70% of our staff during these very turbulent times. But my thoughts tonight are with the 30% of our company whom we've been forced to let go of over the last week. This is a tragic situation, and every single department of the theatre has sustained cuts and losses. Together, we'll get through this, so that one day we can open our doors and celebrate and remember everybody who has sacrificed so much for this extraordinary, ancient, primal storytelling art form we call theatre. I'm again broadcasting from the Hill School in Middleburg, Virginia, in front of a rather extraordinary reproduction of a trompe-l'oeil painting. So I hope that'll bear some interest for you, spotting what objects are behind me throughout the show this evening. My thanks to Hunt Lyman, to Trevor Lord, and the whole team at the Hill School for hosting me. Now, we have tonight a Shakespeare Hour first, with 4 amazing voices from the American Regional Theatre on our panel. Unfortunately, Antoinette Robinson, who is a previously announced guest, is unable to join us this evening at the last minute, but we're very lucky to have, as planned, from Ashland, Oregon, Nataki Garrett, and Amrita Ramanan, Artistic Director and Literary Director of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Nataki and Amrita, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hi there, how are you?
I'm good. Welcome to you both. Wonderful that you are here. Well, let me ask you first, Nataki, are you in Oregon at the moment?
Yeah, I'm in Ashland, Oregon right now. Okay,
and I'm guessing it's very hot.
It is a pretty warm day, but it's mostly mild here. It's been mostly mild here in this summer. I know we're due for a few hot days in a row. I'm looking forward to it, actually.
Okay, good.
Not like DC, but hot.
Okay, it sounds like a nice contrast to the humidity of Virginia. And Amrita, are you there as well?
Yes, I'm in Ashland, on the other side of town than Nataki, although it takes about 10 minutes for us to get to each other's homes. So that gives you a sense of what Ashland is.
Okay, very good. Indeed, the closeness of the relationship between artistic director and literary manager, Dramaturg. So that bodes very well. And how wonderful that you're joining us this evening for our discussion about Shakespeare in America. And now, from Minnesota, from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Joseph Hutch, Artistic Director of the Guthrie Theatre. Joseph, hello, are you there?
I am here. Hi, Simon, how are you?
I'm well. Now, Joseph, would you like me to call you Joe this evening, or would you prefer Joseph?
Oh, Joe, please.
Okay, it'll be Joe. And I'm going to ask you the same question, Joe, if I may. As we're talking about America, where are you tonight?
I am in Minneapolis, which is my home.
Okay, very good. And you've been running the Guthrie for a while, is that right, Joe?
5 years as of 2 weeks ago. July 1 was my 5th anniversary.
Okay, wow. Because Nataki, just going back to you for a second, I think you are, rather like me, a sort of relative newbie in this job of running the Shakespeare Theatre.
Yeah, this was actually the beginning of my first full season. We opened on March 6th, but I have been in Ashland since April of last year.
My goodness. Okay, so how far, so you were just days into your first season when the COVID?
Literally 10 days in, we had to shut everything down because of the COVID crisis.
Extraordinary, 10 days. Oh my goodness, Nataki. I think I got to like 4 months. So,
yeah. We run the calendar year. Most theaters run the school year. So we were going from, in fact, Joe was in town. We were running from March until October. The end of October is the end of our season.
Okay. Well, let's move on to Obie Award-winning actor and playwright. It's Hamish Linklater, everybody. Hi, Hamish.
Hi.
Hi. And how are you, Hamish?
I'm really well. Thanks for asking. I'm in Los Angeles, California, Silver Lake, East Side, and the weather's pleasant here too.
Oh, I'm pleased to hear it. And because of course, I'm so slowly discovering America. I've never been to LA. I have an impression of it being very glamorous. Is that right?
No, your impressions are completely false. It's sort of spread out and not awesome, but there are good, nooks and crannies. I'm in one of the good crannies.
Okay, terrific. Okay, great. Well, I look forward to getting to know more about you and your relationship to Shakespeare and indeed to America shortly. So now it's time, of course, to introduce my co-host, my cohort. It's Drew Lichtenberg, Dramaturg and Literary Manager of the Shakespeare Theatre Company. Hello, Drew.
Hello, Simon.
I'm excited, Drew, because you are somewhere different, I think, this evening than DC.
That is correct. I am in the Outer Banks of North Carolina.
Which is a kind of holiday resort?
It's more like a road that is surrounded by a thin strip of beach on which there are houses that are not lived in year-round, that people from DC and other parts of the mid-Atlantic flock to during like the hellishly hot summer months.
Okay, which is what you're in right now.
Yes, it's a place of sentimental attachment. My wife and I got married here 4 years ago, so we come every year and take a photo.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. Well, Drew, thank you for sharing a little bit about your life, and over to you for the matter at hand.
Yes, we have a comment from Cynthia saying that I am in Hurricane Central. So thank you for the warning, Cynthia.
Well, that's relaxing to know that, Drew. Thank you, Cynthia.
So I want to join Simon in thanking all of our guests for joining us tonight. Before we get started, for those tuning in for the first time, I just want to orient everyone in a few of the features that we have for this webinar. You will notice that there is a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, which you can use. Indeed, people have already been using it to send questions and comments to me and to all the panel. And there is also a chat button if you want to just share observations about hurricanes that are sure to hit and kill me, or tempests, indeed, to be Shakespearean, with the rest of the viewers. Our theme tonight is Shakespeare and America. And, there are a number of ways to approach Shakespeare in America. And I actually had a wonderful talk with my counterpart colleague Amrita last Friday, talking about how should we go about framing this. We decided to talk about Shakespeare in America now, but I think it's interesting to talk a little bit at the top about some of the historical context of Shakespeare in America. Shakespeare performances go back in North America to the 1730s and 1750s, before America was formed. In 1849, the Astor Place riot, which was the largest use of the military against civilians since the Revolutionary War, was brought about in New York by arguments over Shakespeare, specifically political arguments over nativist identity and anti-immigrant sentiment, reflected through the prism of Shakespeare. In 1865, of course, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, the descendant of a Shakespearean actor named Junius Brutus Booth. And as he leapt off the balcony, he shouted, according to his own diary, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is believed to be a reference to something that the historical Junius Brutus said, the ancestor of Shakespeare's Brutus, when he killed Tarquin the Great, and is also considered a pro-Confederate phrase that is in Maryland, My Maryland, which is the official state song still of Maryland, and is also, as one of our viewers has told me, the official state motto of the state of Virginia. So in many ways, this is still our history, which I think is interesting that Americans have turned to Shakespeare since colonial times in order to reflect back their own identity, personally and nationally. And then, of course, in the 20th century, the New Deal and post-World War II, you have the founding of companies like the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in the 30s, the Guthrie and the Stratford Festival by Tyrone Guthrie in the 50s and 60s, the Folger Library in DC, which the Shakespeare Theater itself grew out of, also in the 30s. So we are all gathered here as part of this history. Sorry for the long preamble, but it's impossible to talk about Shakespeare now without talking a little bit about Shakespeare then, and sort of as a continuous line. So what we would like to do, Simon and I, is to start with a brief sort of 90-second or 2-minute question for all of our panelists about how you each come to this discussion of Shakespeare. What role does Shakespeare play in your lives personally? I wonder, Nataki, if we could start with you.
Sure. You know, it's interesting. The role that Shakespeare plays in my life is, you know, I was taught Shakespeare in school. I was lucky to have my first introduction to Shakespeare be Romeo and Juliet with a teacher who thought we should learn it as dramatic literature first, as opposed to literature. So my point of entry was really about performance, and the words on the page were about, you know, how they felt in my body, and watching the bodies of my fellow students, you know, move through that language. So unlike my mother, who was taught Shakespeare as literature solely, my point of entry was about, oh, if you say these words out loud, you feel something. And then I think the other point of entry was the journeys that I could take in the language on my own, when it wasn't about writing a little book report. It was really about trying to figure out how the poetry made me feel. And I did take a real departure from the dramatic literature very early, because I found the sonnets to be much more engaging when I was a kid. How does it live in my life now? I run a Shakespeare company that's 85 years old, that's ensconced in this idea that Shakespeare brings. I was listening to Drew talk about, you know, Shakespeare and the history of America, and how it's embroiled in some of you know, some of the worst parts of our history in terms of how the language and the connections are used in anti-people of color and anti-immigrant and all kinds of framings that sort of are about exclusion. And it's hard for me to separate that idea from this beautiful Shakespeare theater that was started here in 1937 at a time when Ashland was still a sundown town. You know, like all of those things come together. You know, the Shakespeare of my time is a Shakespeare of exclusion. I just am lucky to have been introduced to it as a tool of inclusion. And so when I stumble across people whose history with Shakespeare is this idea of exclusion, I try to form a bridge. You know, here's another way in.
You mentioned Ashland being a sundown town. I wonder, for anyone who's not aware of that phrase or term, if you could gloss that for us.
Right. If you go back in your recent history books, there were still a number of towns in the United States in which Black people in particular were not allowed to be to exist in, to be anywhere near after the sun went down. And what that meant is that if you were caught after the sun went down, you could lose your life. And so it's part of why, you know, if you've heard lately about things like the tools like the Green Book, which is an actual tool that African Americans use to drive across country so that you would know when you were coming to a town whether or not it was friendly enough for you to get gas at the gas station, or get food or water, or you know, eat or sleep someplace. And if it wasn't one of those towns, you better figure out a way to get around that town, or you better figure out a way through it very quickly, because you could lose your life. And so Ashland was still ensconced in its history with the Ku Klux Klan, and embroiled in that kind of very, you know, Oregon was a utopic state. And what that meant is that it was a state that was unfettered by all of the things that other states were dealing with. It came in as a non-slave state, and the way they did that was they just decided that Black people couldn't live here. And so a sundown town is the way in which you execute that. You just make sure they're not here. They can drive through, but they can't stay. You better get out of town pretty quickly. So in 1937, Ashland itself was still a sundown town, where the population of Black people was 0 or less. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Joe, difficult to make an easy transition here, but I wonder if you could talk about your relationship to Shakespeare. And
yeah, sure. Thanks, Drew. I came to Shakespeare in relative terms very late. I was an indifferent student. School was sort of a problem for me, so I didn't go very often. And I managed to not read any Shakespeare plays. And I was growing up in Miami, and I didn't see a professional play until I was an adult. And so I was an actor before I became a director, before I became an artistic director. And I went to graduate school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And it's the first time I read a Shakespeare play from beginning to end, and which sounds lunatic, and I suspect is, but I came to it really late. So I didn't grow up with all the orthodoxies around it, or what it was supposed to be, or what it was meant to be, which frankly I'm very grateful for, because the plays, they spoke to me so entirely, and I just devoured them, and I've ended up making my life so much around the plays of Shakespeare, which I adore entirely. But I kind of love that I came to it a little bit later, and with fewer sort of expectations around what it needs to feel like, be like, etc. And further to Nataki's point, for a person of color coming up in the American theater, one of the few places in the classical canon where people of color could find themselves long before anybody thought of putting a person of color into a Shaw play was Shakespeare. Like, it was one of the places way ahead of contemporary drama and way ahead of most of the rest of the classical canon. I think Ibsen, Chekhov, but any of them. Shakespeare plays kind of in the American theater were first, and it was places where people of color could find themselves on stage in classical work when much of the rest of the canon wasn't available to us.
Yeah, I think one theme that seems to be emerging is that Shakespeare has a very personal meaning to a lot of people, but also can be used as a political tool very conveniently, for good or for bad. Amrita, I'm curious how you would answer this question.
My relationship to Shakespeare is very complex, and I appreciate what you said, Drew, because I do think the political tool definitely manifests in it. So I am the child of parents who were raised in South India and immigrated to this country in their 20s. And my brother and I were the firstborn of our generation in this country. And our ancestry is from a country that today Shakespeare is the most prominently produced playwright as a result of colonialism. And so when I was growing up, there was a lot of personal disdain for Shakespeare in my household, a lot of challenge with the work of Shakespeare dominating the many art forms that were traditional to India that had been erased during colonialism, and also a recognition of Shakespeare's prominence that goes across India and the US and many other areas. And so I was in a household where my mother made it a point that I learn all forms of traditional Indian art. I studied Bharatanatyam, which is a classical dance and theater form, since the age of 6. And that continues to be a very important part of my life. But then also the counterpart to my upbringing in America is I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. And at the time in Las Vegas, Nevada, the theater was basically whatever traveling theater was coming to Las Vegas, or what theater might be considered on the Strip. And so my parents avoided any of the theater and the casinos, but what they did take me to was Shakespeare in the Park, which was a regular offering. And, I remember the experience of what it meant to see Shakespeare in a setting that was free, in a setting that was open seating, in a setting that did have representation on stage that was still predominantly white, but also started to have more of a reflection as I grew up that was closer to my identity and the identity of my peers of color. And as a dramaturg, you know, I started to find myself in this very complex relationship because I was incredibly curious about the stories of Shakespeare. I was incredibly curious about how he created characters, how his form, in my opinion, evolved. You know, the romances are, you know, some of my favorites because I think that they're his most experimental plays. And I feel like if Shakespeare was living today, he would be in developmental workshops experimenting with all of those plays, because I feel like there was something there that he couldn't quite crack at the moment that I feel would have evolved. And I found myself also, you know, very moved by the rigor of his work, the way in which he was able to create such a large body of work within his lifetime. And so I continued to navigate that in terms of my, you know, curiosity for his life and work, and how, in particular, that started to apply to my curiosity of how living playwrights are engaging with their work today. You know, we hear about the way in which Shakespeare wrote for the audiences of his time and was very intentionally setting his plays within contexts that were able to speak to issues, ideas, questions, reflections of the population that that he was living in. And so I always find that, you know, an interesting invitation around relevancy and, you know, what are the ways in which we can uplift that ethos today? You know, what's the canon of today that we can think of?
Wow, yeah. I mean, so many threads to pull from what you say, Amrita, but I think two are really pertinent. One is Joe Papp's Shakespeare in the Park, which again was born out of this post-World War II rise of the American middle class, this idea that culture should be free, should be for everyone, should be democratic. I think that leads directly to the founding of the public theater and something like Hamilton, which, you know, seems to be in the news again. And also this idea that Shakespeare is the hero, in my opinion, of this anti-classical canon. The great irony of him being associated with the classics is that he's wildly experimental, anti-Aristotelian, did not follow any dramatic rules, wrote as his inspiration took him. Hamish, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your relationship to Shakespeare.
I came to Shakespeare at the beginning of my life. My mom started this theater company called Shakespearean Company. She came, I'm wearing her t-shirt actually, which is from her book, but I've got the lighting wrong so you can't even see it. You can't get this t-shirt online, I made it. She came to the United States in 1963 to be part of Kennedy's America from London. He was murdered. Week after she got here, she didn't have anything to do. Fortunately, there was all this money going into the regional theaters from the Ford Foundation, et cetera. So you had all of these barns opening up across the country, and this acting base that was trained in the method to be real, but they couldn't be heard. And so my mom is this voice teacher, and her method arrived at exactly the right moment of money and method needing to meet. And Shakespeare is sort of, he was ready for both things. He was ready for the emotional truth that American actors had, that British actors at that time didn't have, because they were all singing these songs. And then you had this country with all of these beautiful, distinct regional voices that Shakespeare was writing for, and these hard R's, you know, which we love so much. So so she was at the Guthrie at the beginning. She was at Stratford at the beginning, and a bunch of other theaters, and started NYU, the Tisch program there, and then started Shakespearean Company, and that was where I grew up, which was outdoor theater at the Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts. And they had to fill, you know, a big outdoor lawn with all of this natural voice, truth stuff, and that's where that's what I grew up in.
So in other words, Hamish, without this unique relationship between Shakespeare and America, you would not have been born. You are the progeny of this special relationship between Shakespeare and America, is what you're saying.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, Mom wouldn't have come here if JFK hadn't been doing civil rights. And then we wouldn't have had, and she wouldn't have had that. She was doing the working theater where she met my dad, and who was a student, hot young student. But yeah, no, I wouldn't be on this Zoom with all of you if it weren't for Shakespeare in America.
Simon, I don't think I've ever asked you this question, and we've been working together for over a year, for years now. What about your relationship to Shakespeare?
Wow, yes, that's it's just been exciting to hear everyone's comments, and I responded to Nataki's point about vibrations of what the words do to the person speaking them. I think Nataki, you spoke about the body and the physical sensation of his language, and I had this experience when I was 17 of playing Hamlet in my school play, and I spent the summer before playing it, listening to some tapes of Kenneth Branagh doing Hamlet on the radio. And actually, the listening of Branagh doing these words, and then basically, I suppose in a rather parrot-like way, to be honest, sort of doing them a bit like how he was doing them. But the main thing was saying them, I think, and remembering them and feeling them. And that sense, and it is a very intimate, personal thing of just going, wow, they make me feel something that I don't feel in my life normally. It's a kind of, well, it's a mystery, isn't it? What is it that one's feeling? But perhaps it's a largeness of feeling, perhaps it's a range of feelings, perhaps it's the thrill of a long thought or a certain kind of feelings and thoughts colliding. And I guess that was how the seed for me was actually quickly realizing that I wasn't a very good actor. So my journey with Shakespeare wasn't going to continue in this way, but perhaps I could stay involved with Shakespeare being a director, which is some level also tasting the language, or at least facilitating the language to pass through the bodies of others. Ultimately, of course, reaching the body of the audience, since I think theatre is a visceral, physical experience. And then I was thinking a little bit, as folks were speaking about that lovely expression of Jan Koch, the Polish critic, who influenced so much Peter Brook, Shakespeare are contemporary. And it's such a loaded expression, of course, because what would our contemporary be, look like, feel like? Who are they? I mean, the opening line of Hamlet, who's there, resounds in each of us. And yet there's the paradox, is that we are all different, and yet is there anything that links us? Which we see in front of us and go, yes, that is me and the person to my left and to my right, and somehow beyond, 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 beyond. And I think it's that, and it's a complex search that gets ever more complex, and rightly so. Who is our contemporary and who is Shakespeare? And for me, that's become an even more charged question, because I'm now in another country whereby I'm a sort of like that a character in Twelfth Night, Viola. I've arrived in a new world, and it has given my life great energy, in some sense, to go, who am I? Who are you? And who is Shakespeare?
Along those lines, Simon, we have a very interesting and I think stimulating question from our viewer, James, who cites the book by a previous guest of the Shakespeare Hour, James Shapiro, his book, Shakespeare in a Divided America. James asks that Shapiro asserts that historically both liberals and conservatives have found something to like in Shakespeare, but Shapiro contends that in our current era, some conservatives regard Shakespeare as part of an elitist culture and have no love for the bard, or have lost their love for the bard. Do you think Shapiro is right, that Shakespeare is becoming less appealing to conservatives? If so, what effect might that have on the future of Shakespeare in America? I wonder if any of our artistic directors relish answering this question.
Sorry, go ahead, Amrita, sorry, go.
Oh no, Joe, go ahead, please.
I mean, it's a fascinating question. I don't know that Shakespeare has less for conservatives than for any other American political group. I will say that I think the brilliance of Shakespeare is that we see ourselves in those plays wherever we happen to stand. I don't think Shakespeare breaks down across America's political divide in any way, and that the beauty of the plays themselves is that they operate as kinds of ink blots. We see what we want to see in them. We make them from a point of view. You don't have to look much further than a Julius Caesar and a number of productions of it. You know, depending on how you approach that play, you have different politics. It can hold the politics that you bring to the play. And I was sharing that there's no evidence of any production in America of Troilus and Cressida prior to 1926, and only a handful between 1926 and the 60s, and that handful only enough to prove that the play was terrible and nobody should ever do the play. And then Vietnam happened, and all of a sudden everybody understood that play, because there aren't folks in white hats and black hats. We don't know who the good guys are versus the bad guys in the play. You know, Shakespeare is wrestling with political ambiguity all the time, and he no sooner seems to be making an argument in favor of one thing that he is circumventing or suggesting its opposite somewhere else. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact why we haven't had blocks of time in America's history where we've done Shakespeare, and then there's another political universe where we do no Shakespeare, and then we do it again. And we see with many other classical playwrights, as we think of the Western canon, they fall in and out of favor in a way that seems to me Shakespeare never has. And I think it's, anyway, it's a fascinating question, of course, and I've not read Shapiro on this to know what he's thinking in terms of it moving away from the conservative voice. But anyway, that's a response.
Wonderful. And yeah, I think you might be right, Joe, that people can see whatever they want to see in Shakespeare. There is a Rorschach test quality to a lot of Shakespeare. I'm wondering if there are any devil's advocates. Amrita, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, you know, something that I've been curious about, I have found that I think across political ideologies that there's varying relationships to Shakespeare, and I don't think that it's polarized towards conservatives or liberals. I think that there's always a variety, and I agree with Joe that I think Shakespeare's plays do provide a particular container in translation. So I think that there's an identification within particular plays based on how they are translated in production that can then encourage conversation. But I will say this too, I do find that within particular plays, there's a fascinating dialogue that can happen that does speak to a current moment that might have already provided some existence of relevancy, but then could also come to the surface again. So a recent example is, you know, I believe it was Shapiro who was talking about how Coriolanus presaged the Trump administration. And I remember when reading that article and hearing the conversations around it, that there was a political divide around what Shapiro was speaking to Coriolanus and then what Shakespeare was actually meaning when he wrote Coriolanus. And so I think that within the individual plays, there is interesting possibility around that form of debate, but within Shakespeare's work as a whole, or the canon, I think that it's across the board.
And of course, Jim also worked on the production in the park of Julius Caesar that had a very Trump-like Caesar figure. So I think Jim's politics are pretty clear, maybe in that regard. I don't know, maybe we should invite Jim back on the Shakespeare Hour and ask him this question. Yeah, so now we turn to the second half of our conversation tonight, America. We've talked a lot about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's relationship to America. What would you say your working definition is of America as theater artists, as leaders in the field? Nataki, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about what is this idea of defining America, because as a Black woman in this country, it's always been defined for me. And so I don't know if I have access to this idea of creating a real definition that I could rely on in terms of how I survive in my existence here. And so I feel like if I have to really think about what I think America is this this troubling so-called experiment that really does, you know, it does start in some of the most awful ways we can imagine. That has been trying to move past its past since the beginning, by offering this sort of image of itself to itself so that it believes it's doing the thing that it wants to be doing, right? It's part of the lords. You come here because it's, the madmen tell you what it is, and you think that's what it is. America, for me, has always been pitted up against what the framing that the dominant society has always given me, right? So somebody will say, well, my parents came here as immigrants in the 30s, and and they worked their way up, and they have this, and then that's a framing of America. And then America is also like growing up in the 80s in the Bay Area, in the middle of the crack scourge, and trying to figure out, what is this war on me? Is it the war on my friends? Is the war on my city? Is the war on my town? Like, that's America. America is in this constant kind of tumult around who it wants to be, who it actually is, who it belongs to, why it exists, where it should go. America is a stolen space that is occupied lands that continues to put its hands over its ears around whose land and how it was taken and how many treaties were broken. America is a place of so-called freedom, a series of freedoms, decades and centuries of this idea of freedom, where it's been chasing this unattainable idea of what freedom is. And America's answer tends to be, you are free because you are not necessarily because we are all free. And so it's interesting, because if I think about that with the backdrop of Shakespeare, if I just let him rummage around in the back of my skull for a little bit, I start to imagine that America is not unlike any other place under the sun. That it is in this constant evolution, that it is constantly trying to figure out what it is, and it will come back through violence, aggression, through peacetime and prosperity. It keeps having to fight with itself in order to become itself. And so it is not the land of perfection. It is not the land of freedom. It is not the land of ideology. It is not the land of opportunity. And yet it is all those things at the same time. And right now, America is this place where when I tell my kids, later on, basically what happened was there was a pandemic crisis in which, people were dying, around us. And there was an uprising in the middle of it that said, hey, America, let me take you by your collar and tell you what you need to be. That's also America, where we can fail so miserably at containing a pandemic. And at the same time, because of that, because of the backs of the people that uprising is starting on, because watching a live murder, in broad daylight that was filmed by a teenager who received, backlash for not intervening while 4 cops sat on the back of a person and choked him to death. That is also America. And that is at the seat of my experience of it. And so I find myself as an American constantly grappling. I'm also in the body of the kind of human in which I am invited to leave every single time I criticize this country, to which I normally say something like, great, now you start the boat again, I'll hop back on it and, head back across with you. My ancestors on both sides of my family were brought here forcibly. So whatever that America was that some other people came to is not the America that I exist in. And so I constantly grapple with this idea of what America is.
Just want to shout out our viewer, Peggy, who said that was a very moving response, Nataki. So thank you and thank you, Peggy, and thank you, Nataki, for your comments. Question for Hamish from Hunt. I wonder if someone wants to address the issue of American pronunciation. This is something that you brought up in regards to your mother, and sort of like the school of American accents versus English accents, and which accent is more authentic than the other for performing Shakespeare. Hamish, you're making a hilarious face right now. You're muted. So
yeah. The best way to pronounce it is moot. It's actually pronounced moot, and now I've unmuted myself. I think, yeah, I'm not an expert on it. I mean, my mom, all of the, I understand at Shakespeare's times that there was a lot of pronunciations that are closer to American pronunciations than they are to RP pronunciations. So that's, you know, just like a simple thing. You know, I don't know. It's going to be up to every production to decide how you want to talk about it. I mean, Shakespeare's he was a popular guy. When we were talking about like his politics, I mean, or Coriolanus was, you know, he was the lowest of the low classes were sort of a mob in a bunch of those plays, and you know, you make fun of them, and he makes fun of them a lot. But those were his biggest fans. Those guys are there. I mean, they were there. The groundlings are there. So I think you, and you know, I think it's a movable feast. I think if you're going to be doing certain, if you're going to make a rhyme work, then maybe you want to have a liquid U, or you want to say Duke or Duke, if you wanted to rhyme with pook or puke. But if you want to make fun of that rhyme that's there on the page, then you do the opposite and you say Louvre. I mean, there's so many Louvre rhymes in there, and certainly no one was saying Louvre ever. Maybe they were. Maybe we've been watching Mary Poppins. I'm sure there's some Louvre in there, but I'm definitely of the school that, you know, I worked with Peter Hall a little bit, who was like so strict, and I'm of the school that you learn all the rules so that you can break all the rules, but why would you like throw out tools because they come from the wrong toolkit? You know, you make yourself a much more powerful individual if you know every different way to pronounce puke. So and then you become a great artist by choosing the right one at the right time. Yeah.
Two more questions for the group. One from Denise on this question of shifting American cultural values and how they affect our reception of Shakespeare's plays. And she cites Taming of the Shrew, for instance, which she remembers being a favorite play in the repertory when she was in college, but now seems to have grown offensive. So what do you do as a person at a Shakespeare company? Do you produce those plays? Do you find new ways of doing those plays? Do you perform counterplays to those plays? And a question from Jared: Shakespeare's England was a place of enormous social conflict and change, Catholic and Protestant, the growth of cities. Do you think this makes Shakespeare an especially apt mirror for a land of immigrants and for a country of perpetual change, as Nataki was saying? And I think of what you were saying, Amrita, about being a child of immigrants, or the fact that India was a colony and America was a colony. We are colonized subjects, and we are taking the culture of the colonizers in Shakespeare and using it to reflect our own culture, which I think is a really interesting kind of, and it's sort of reflected in what Hamish was talking about with learning the rules of the colonizer in order to break the rules. So what do we think about shifting cultural mores and also Shakespeare as a mirror for change?
You know, I don't think, to the question about plays like Taming of the Shrew or Merchant of Venice, or, I mean, choose your play. As somebody who runs a classics theater where roughly 50% of our work in any season is coming out of what we think of as the Western classical canon, if we're trying to measure plays by today's politics, our world, our culture, who we are today, if we're only going to measure it by that yardstick, nothing passes, nothing. You can't do any plays that are 50 years old or old. You can't do any of them. They're all problematic, everyone. So you determine what's the purpose of picking up one of these plays. What are you attempting to examine by picking up a Taming of the Shrew or a Merchant of Venice or an Othello or a Henry V? I mean, any of these plays are problematic seen explicitly and only through a contemporary lens. My belief, and speaking for my single self, It's impossible for me to believe that if Shakespeare, whoever he or they were writing today, that playwright wouldn't be among our most progressive playwrights. It's impossible for me to think otherwise. But we're all products of our time. None of us live outside the social systems of our time. And so you decide how you're going to grapple with the things that are complicated about those plays in a way that could be good or useful in contemporary society. But I would simply say that this extends far outside the Shakespeare canon. This is all of anything that we look back to. And I think if the answer to that is we should only make new plays, which are current with what's going on now, I think most of us would think, well, we'd be missing the trick if that were the case. So we pick up those plays, problematic as they may be. We wrestle with them in the best way that we know how, and then we set them down for the next artist, the next generation, the next folks to pick it up and go. Just to share a very quick anecdote. When I directed Hamlet at the Folger some years ago, I had a chance to go down into the archives of that building, which are incredible, where the library actually is. And there's this whole shelf of the prompt scripts of the Hamlets, and there's Keane's Hamlet, and there's Booth's Hamlet, and all the notes in the all this, like, they're just a bunch of idiots. Like, we are now wrestling with everything that's impossible about that great text. And so one becomes comfortable that you get in the river, you swim for a bit, you get back out, and the river keeps going, and other people participate in it. And that's how culture is shared. And I think I've drifted from the point. But I think those plays, maybe every one of Shakespeare's plays is a problem play, every single one. None of them, 2 of them, in my view, would survive modern dramaturgy, Romeo and Juliet and Henry V. The rest would not survive modern dramaturgy. They wouldn't. They're impossible experiments. And I think each generation of theater artists wrestles with them in the ways that they know best.
Can I say, I think it's a real problematic time that we're living in, and that's why it's so exciting. But why would you want to produce a non-problematic play? The non-problematic play does not address a very problematic time. But I think you have to be doing it with purpose.
Fascinating question along these lines from Christopher, and Nataki, you've raised your hand, but this is for you. Christopher says, I recall having a conversation with a friend one time in which she commented that she didn't care about Shakespeare because as an African-American woman, he did not speak to her. I tried mightily to talk about how I think Shakespeare is timeless and has something to say to many different groups, but coming from a white guy, that understandably falls on deaf ears. Nataki earlier spoke about using Shakespeare as a tool for inclusion. I'm really eager to know more about that. How does one use Shakespeare as a tool for inclusion? Is it just a matter of placing the context of the play in a different way, or is there something else to it?
Yeah, interesting question, because it actually speaks to some of this. So I'm thinking a little bit about recently listening to Lonnie Bunch in an NPR article talk about, what should happen with the statues that are being taken down of the Confederate generals. Like, what should happen to those? Should we, should we jump them all in the river? Should we bury them in the ground? Should we dismantle them and make them into something else? Like, should we put them in a museum and remind ourselves of how treacherous we've been? And I think it's tricky because this idea of who it speaks to and why is actually embedded in the same question as the previous one, which is I had this woman send me a letter in my 3rd month here at OSF, and she had taken her daughter had come to see our production of All's Well That Ends Well in the 2019 season, and it's a terrible play. But so, if you break down the plot for yourself and you go like, what the hell were you doing? Were you just trying to get the nobles to write you a check? Like, what are you doing with this play? This woman has to rape this guy in order to prove the consummation of her marriage so that he doesn't like her because she's too poor. I was just like, what in the world is this stupid play that I remember reading, but this is my first production. Anyway, her daughter had gone to see this play with her class. We have a lot of young people coming through. And I'll just get to the seed of her letter that sticks with me, because what she's asking for is actually a real thing. She says, you know, these productions are great, and I'm so glad that there's a Shakespeare theater here, you know, and my kid, you know, will go to it. And I went to OSF when I was a kid, so I recognize how important it is. But we have to be careful about the impact of telling stories that continue to center ways in misogyny, and ways in which being white and male are centered, and ways in which being white and male can be destructive, and that's okay because it's you know, we continue to uplift stories that are racist and anti-Semitic, and she said, unless the framing around that play is consistently saying to a group of young people, watch this play, and here, wait, use this tool while you watch it, because if you haven't lived on this earth long enough, you don't know what the impact of these ideas are going to be, right? Unless you can have the pop-up happen at the same time as the play. We're dealing with a generation that watches the image in the framing, and they take on the image in the framing. And they don't necessarily have the capacity, and they don't have the tools yet to be able to unpack it so they have a kind of deeper, more complex way of dealing with it. And I think it's true, you know? I think you have a story that teaches, you know, that it's okay to beat a woman up if she doesn't really want to marry you. And that's what they take from it, right? And maybe later on they live a little bit longer, and maybe they don't use that seed that's been planted, you know, against somebody that they claim to love. Or maybe they do, and they remember it's justified by continuing to amplify and uplift these ideas, because we uplift, you know, the voice of this person. And so I think we have to be careful, because I don't think you know, destroy literature, but I'm not interested in doing a play about Mein Kampf either, right? And I'm not interested in going back to Hitler's, you know, representations through film. And, you know, like, I'm not interested. I had a teacher once who said, you know, Nataki, you should really watch Birth of a Nation. It is truly a great film. And I was like, actually, I live in it. I don't have to watch it, right? And you should stop amplifying that. There are other things to amplify. So as we continue to focus on Shakespeare and the impact, that letter, this idea that the impact is different on me. You know, I'm privileged enough to have understanding, and not, I'm not an intellect in Shakespeare. I'm basically a voyeur, you know. But if it's going to have impact, I have to be responsible as an artistic director for the impact from the youngest person in the room to the oldest person in the room, to all the experiences in between there, for all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds. I have to be willing to take on the responsibility of that. I can't put it into the world and say, oh, well, you know, oh, you're dumb enough to become anti-Semitic because of this. You know, that's your problem. I have to do something about that. And so I don't know if it's doing plays that sort of counter it, or constantly having conversations, but I do feel fully responsible for it.
Amrita has her hand raised.
Yeah. I was furiously shaking my head in agreement when Nataki was talking. I know everyone in the digital sphere can see that, but 100% agree with that. And with that, you know, what comes to mind for me is just the reality that I do not believe Shakespeare is for everyone. And I say that with deep joy, because I do not believe that our global culture is a monolith. And so I recognize that there will be a variety of desires, opinions, perspectives, interrogations. And that to me is a beautiful thing, in the same way that, you know, Kalidasa is not for everyone, yet that has a very personal relationship to me and my culture and my cultural origin in theater. And so with that, you know, when it comes to talking about, you know, the continued, you know, production of the plays, the retiring of certain plays, you know, why do Shakespeare at all? You know, I think it's a very, I find it to be both an individual and a collective philosophy. Individually, you know, I respond and embrace artists who want to grapple with plays. I respond and embrace artists who say, actually, I do not find this play relevant anymore, and I don't want to work with it, and I don't want to feel beholden to it for any particular reason, because I constantly remind myself that Shakespeare was not, you know, not an idol. Shakespeare was a human being, and so I treat Shakespeare with the humanity of their writing in the same way that I consider the humanity of others. So I respect that there could have been a potency at the time when Shakespeare was writing The Merchant of Venice, and based on the construction of that play, which in my opinion is constructed as a comedy, that doesn't have the same resonance now. And that could mean that you grapple with it, and that could mean you retire it. And I think that that can be an individual choice for artists. And I also really respond to the artists that say, we put Shakespeare too much in the center, and why are we not focusing more prominently on the playwrights of our time in the way in which Shakespeare was able to receive such great prominence in his time that's carried over? Why are we not focusing on that? But ultimately, you know, what I uplift from what Nataki said is that there is a responsibility. And there always needs to be a responsibility of why Shakespeare, why this play, why in this moment, who is our audience, and what are we doing to actually create engagement and dialogue that can allow for these questions to be able to be multifaceted in their response as opposed to dictating an answer.
Well, and what I agree that I think it is a choice that comes down on an individual and also a collective level. And I think that what resonated with me in Nataki's response was this, I thought of Brecht, you know, who was making theater directly as the Nazis were gaining power and was finding all these ways of highlighting or underlining that what you see represented is not okay. Like, just because we are staging this does not mean we are endorsing it. We want you to think about it and why. And in my opinion, Brecht is the reason why the definition of directing changed from merely the artful arrangement of people on a stage to thinking about the moral, political, social impact of what is being represented. There is no Jan Kott in Shakespeare Our Contemporary. There's no idea of treating Shakespeare as a contemporary without Brecht. So in some ways, and of course Brecht would say he was just stealing from Shakespeare, who himself was finding ways of telling people, what I'm staging is not the same thing as endorsing it. I don't know if we'll solve this question tonight, but I do think that it is the question, right? Simon, on a somewhat lighter note, and Hamish, you have your hand raised, we have a viewer asking where you come down on the accent question. Are you a purist like Peter Hall? Would you kick Hamish Linklater out of your rehearsal room for saying moot instead of mute?
Well, thank you. It's wonderful feeling that the pendulum swing between all these extraordinary topics. But before I give my thoughts on pronunciation, I don't want to deprive Hamish for coming in on the debate that we were just together in there. And then, Hamish, do you want to talk to some of those, I think, amazing points that were just raised?
Oh yeah, I just thought, I mean, all of that. I was really the thing. I think any director directing a Shakespeare play now, woe befall them if they do not take into account the audience that comes in with this new framing and with it. I mean, I think the quickest way for the Shakespeare plays to end up on a dusty shelf in a museum is for them to say, this is how you should be viewing the world now, because you shut off. My 13-year-old, I mean, dragging her to Shakespeare is a struggle, and she just played Viola. Oh God, we tore her beat her up to go, and it wasn't until like the last performance before COVID shut down the theater that she was like, oh, I actually did like saying those lines, you know, they made some sense to me. But I think it's like, it is the responsibility of all these artistic directors and all of these directors to program plays because they know this audience, and where are they going to meet? Where are the plays going to meet the audience, and where is the audience going to meet these plays, so that we have a vibrant night of theater, so that the theaters survive, so that Shakespeare survives, but mostly so that America becomes the better version of itself that it really wants to be.
Wow, I mean, that's extremely hard to follow. That's thank you, Hamish, in terms of building on
my American accent.
Yeah. And it's funny, you know, it's almost, I don't think I've ever really thought about pronunciation, I have to admit. I mean, maybe this has been an omission in my life, but in that I think what we're all speaking about one way or another is ownership, by which empowered ownership of going, really Shakespeare thrives when the speaker feels related and allowed to be most freely themselves through this language. That Shakespeare is incomplete as a writer, and that's, I think, his genius. He's incomplete because he wants the associations of the performer, the creative team, the director, ultimately the audience. And it's when we free associate together and construct these paradigms, and also, and I think, Nataki, in a way, your poem defining what America is, you described and evoked paradox. And that, I think, going back to where we started this evening about what is the sensation of speaking Shakespeare, well, maybe it's that, it's experiencing paradox. And that's so critical for us right now, because whether for any group, it's simply not true to our world to say it is A or B, it is B or A. It is simply all things mingling and coexisting and firing, and hurting and loving and broken and hopeful. And when we get into that space, then we serve Shakespeare, I think. And when we become distracted with the detail of pronunciation, we become inhibited. And that's the enemy, I feel, if there is such a thing.
Well, I think on that note, it has been an hour for the Shakespeare Hour. I want to thank our wonderful panel of guests, Nataki, Joe, Hamish, Amrita. You are all brilliant, and I'm inspired to be in this conversation with you. Next week, we will be doing something completely different, Shakespeare and opera. Our guest will be Francesca Zambello, the artistic director of the Washington National Opera and the Glimmer Glass Festival in Sarasota Springs, I believe. And tenor Russell Thomas, who played her Otello at the Kennedy Center last autumn. So see you all next week, and good night, everyone.